And Corey's really been an innovator in remote sensing, landslide science, and so I'm very excited to hear the innovation he's going to present to us today. And I hope you guys heard that too. And if not, great. All right, take it away, Corey. I'll get on mute.
We did, and I don't need to say any more. Well, I'll start getting going and sharing here, and just get a confirmation that you're seeing my presentation mode. Somebody, everything's looking good, Manfred.
It looks
Okay,
good, and
so
I would like to add to everybody that we are recording this presentation. I hope that's fine for everybody, and we put the presentation then at the end on the YouTube channel of LandAware. Thank you.
Thanks. So as Ben said, I've had a varied career. I guess I'm 31 years in now, and my focus has been on deep-seated landslides, predominantly in shallow, slowly moving landslides and shales and glacial sediments. But of course, pretty also quite significant experience in large deep-seated rock slope movements. My career is, as I said, Ben said, portions of it were with the Alberta Geological Survey, where I led the geohazards group and was director of the survey. But that was sandwiched between a decade of consulting and now another good period in consulting, where I have worked with some great companies. And you'll see on my logo slide here, I'm a private consultant, but I work very closely with a number of other groups, including the group I formerly was employed with, BGC Engineering, where I still work probably 50% of my time focused on working with teams and leading teams in this area I'm going to talk about today. When we talk about awareness and LandAware, I came from a world of early warning where it's you have a sensor, you see something accelerate, and everybody runs. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about regional landslide early warning, and we're talking about warning of process change, of velocity change, of activity change for landslides that just continually move slowly over time. Over the last 5 years, we've been very fortunate working as a private consultant to have a wealth of information and paid consulting work to try to understand why landslides accelerate, where they accelerate, and more importantly, when they accelerate. And what I'm going to do is talk about the key learnings on really understanding and characterizing these trends for 3 large projects that we're working on as a team. In the upper is the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, and this is just a map. The black are pipelines, to which the company I work with, BGC, actively supports geohazard management. So there's hundreds of thousands of kilometers of pipelines in Alberta, where I live. It's really the center of the oil and gas extraction in Western Canada. But we also have other projects driven, in Eastern Canada, in the Appalachian Plateau, and in Washington State. And I'll talk a bit about those and what's driving those studies. But they're all similar studies that we're trying to understand spatial temporal relationships of landslides. So when we're getting to regional warning or territorial warning, again, it's not a slide with a sensor and a threshold. It is, are we seeing trends that we would expect a certain representative population of landslides to start their activity to change, and really to accelerate? And how do you do that? Well, we're going to talk about the difficulties in doing that, especially because these are not landslides where you have a big rain event, you get a rapid slide, and you had vegetation one day and no vegetation the other day. So you date the date of the vegetation loss and say, well, that was the landslide. You can't do that with these landslides. So we'll talk about that. The other thing that's really driving what we're doing this project are the types of decisions that people are making. These aren't catastrophic. These landslides typically are not things you see in the news like Blatten. They are things that slowly continue to move. There's highways, railways, communities built on these. And as long as the strain rate is controlled and predictable, that's how things are typically designed. It's when things start to accelerate, that is, and we start getting accelerations and strain that, that really becomes unacceptable for infrastructure. And when you come, and really the types of questions that asset managers ask are, can we understand how these trends are developing, where they might be developing more quickly than other areas, and can I look out over months to years and understand these trends and make different decisions around resources and how I allocate resources. If I have, $10 million this year, and that's my landslide mitigation budget, do I spread it across the entire region, or do I actually focus it in a region where I expect things to be more active over the next season or two? So in order to do that, what do we need? Well, as I mentioned, with shallow landslides, you look at landslide scars and timing. Well, we need to look at data that gives us an indication of the timing of accelerations. And as we're trying to forecast forward, we need to look back. So what type of data do we have regionally that lets us know how landslides behave? If we can put together that time series of how landslides behave over time, what has driven those? And we are focused on hydroclimatically driven landslides, so moisture, water balance. So, what do we know about water balance at a regional scale that we can correlate with those landslides? And then when you come up to actually coming up with what's a threshold we should use, it's understanding who are the users and what type of warning is meaningful and actionable, which gets to some of those timing questions we talked about. So I'm going to talk about 3 different regions and how, what we've learned in those 3 different regions that's really starting to guide what we do moving forward, specifically around really understanding which type of landslides we have in regions and how they react to different inputs of water, how we're finding the temporal trends with other point source or remote sense data and the intricacies in that. And then how we're starting to really link the data around landslide activity and hydroclimatic drivers and where that's advancing. So, the type of landslides matters. Whether you're in finer grain, coarser grain, soils, hard rock, soft rock, hard soils, it matters. And really when we're looking at trying to correlate moisture inputs and change, you really need to have a geological and a kinematic model in place. And you need to understand how these landslides move. And you need to have hypotheses for what you think the relative contribution of water is and how that impacts a movement. Because again, so we're focusing on slow-moving translational rotational landslides to which infrastructure is built on and slowly strains over time. So that's the type of thing we're worried about. So we're focused on, typically this suite of finer grained, flatter, relatively flat slopes that just continuously move. And likely the first time landslides occurred tens of thousands of years ago, and now we're just having slow creep of colluvium. So that's what we're typically focused on. So one of the first project I want to talk about is the Appalachian Plateau in the eastern US. It's an area where when you look at failure stats for pipelines, the rate of failure of pipelines here is 10 times the international average. And there really hadn't been much coordinated work on understanding why things acted differently across the region. So we worked with 6 pipeline operators, received a data set of over 40,000 mapped landslides. We received then a data set around characterization where they had confirmed that there was actually activity and active landslides and movement based on field observations, instrumentation, or measurement of actual strain on pipelines. So that's what the yellow dots are here. We also pulled together data as to which sites were instrumented, which are the red dots, and where we had previously publicly documented pipeline failures, which are the blue. So we started seeing clustering, definitely as to, where landslides have been, confirmed active, but also where landslides are instrumented. So, where pipeline companies are spending money to put on instruments, that's typically, an area that they're quite concerned about. So it's why is there the difference across this region? So some of you might know my colleague Corey Froese in North Carolina. He started pulling topographic data around for a 10-kilometer grid around each active landslide and started saying what is similar, what is the relief, what are the slope angles, and definitely started seeing, very clear trends. In the north, the orange, lower relief, lower slope angles versus in the south, higher relief, steeper slope angles. So that started giving us clues. When you pull that together with the geology underneath, you start to be able to and the topography, you start to be able to pull those zones out as to where you have similar, regional morphology, and those similar groups of slope angles, and really started breaking out the area into distinct zones. And we're in the stage now, we've just received the confirmation and contractual for the next stage of funding. The next stage will be pulling together all the temporal data we have around displacement in these regions using, the USGS and NASA data sets, using the instrumentation we have. Our hypotheses and what we know are in the north in the orange. Again, flatter slopes, finer grain sediments, slowly creeping landslides that the only way they can measure and confirm how they're moving is to instrument them. On the south, in this what they call the Pottsville's formation, coarser grain, steeper slopes, more rapid shallow slope movements, and then the transition zones. So the next step will be actually linking the hydroclimatic drivers and kind of testing our hypotheses, and then providing a framework to have operators be able to track trends like longer term moisture accumulation or certain types of storms that they may want to track to look for potential acceleration. So that's the first phase. The second phase is trying to understand the temporal patterns. And this is, I'm going to show initially some work we've done in Western Canada. So this is the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. I'm in Edmonton, which is kind of in the center bottom there. That's Ben's hometown. And what you see on the upper map is a landslide susceptibility model of the basin, Cretaceous, deep sedimentary basin, extensively glaciated, and anywhere there's a modern day watercourse, it cuts into a complex sequence of glacial seds and Cretaceous bedrock, which is what the representation is below. So any valley slope you're crossing, you have a community close to the river, you have a railway, a highway, you're crossing deep-seated landslides that are moving. And we did a review about 6 years ago interviewing asset managers, and a conservatively low estimate is there's almost $500 million Canadian a year spent on landslide mitigation and repair. So again, you don't see this in the news, but it costs a lot of money. So again, we had a large number of pipeline operators that said, yes, we're going to give you money on data, figure this out. We collected over 500 slope inclinometers from 1980 to present, so point source monitoring, put those in a database and said, okay, what does that data tell us? On the upper right was the first chuck of the data at the wall. You might squint your eyes and say, of course, there's something happening in the late 1990s and maybe some things around 2010 and definitely a big spike in 2020. But we found that over half or almost half of the locations were either slope inclinometers that were put in buffer zones outside landslides, that were put in mitigated landslides and weren't moving, or had significant installation or reader errors. So we cut out half of those slope inclinometers. We then had a student one summer go through all of them, look at plan view, look at sectional view, and look at time displacement, came up with thinned that down to 252, looked at the trends, said, okay, we're starting to see a little bit more clarity, but there's still a lot of scatter. And when we started working with our data science team and pulling together and looking at hydroclimatic drivers and displacement, we just saw nothing. So the big aha and the big step change for us was realizing, okay, if you're looking at shallow landslides, you're typing an event and you're timing an event. What is an event for a deep-seated landslide? We have a landslide year. We have a very consistent, predictable pattern. We're frozen, from November to February, March. Snow starts to melt, ice starts to come out of the ground, water starts to infiltrate from snowmelt in March, April. You start getting spring showers, you start getting accelerations and landslides, May, June, and by July, August, things start slowing down, and over the fall, they're just flat. Same pattern every year. So if you want to characterize and compare year to year, you need to grab points at the start of the year, before the start of the year, and after the end of the landslide season. So we went through those 252 slope inclinometers, and what you show is a typical plot I was sent, where you have each blue is every reading, where we only kept readings that constrained the landslide year. If you only read a slope inclinometer once every 2 years, we couldn't use the data. If you only read the slope inclinometers in the spring every year, we couldn't use the data because you were in the middle of the acceleration trend. So we really thinned down, but we really had a high quality data set. The other thing that we did that was really important is when you look at this data, you can look across slope or slopes in a region, and something that was moving at 2 millimeters a year that accelerates to 10 versus something that was moving at 10 that accelerates to 60, how do you compare those? So we also realized that normalizing the data was pretty critical for a regional study. So essentially, we took from a scale of 0 to 1 at each different slope inclinometer or shape accelerator location, and compared all readings against all the readings at that location, where 1 was the fastest reading we've ever seen and 0 was the slowest, and started to look at relatively where we were seeing higher normalized movements at locations. And of course, you start to see like 2020, which was an epic year. Yes, things start to line up. So that started to make sense. But also, when we started working with our data science team and pulling together hydroclimatic data, trends started to line up, which was really important. So, the defining the landslide year and the normalization were a big deal for us. The other way that we're trying, again, you're at the mercy of your data if you're looking back. So the other way we've started doing this as well is where we have remote sense data, and specifically INSAR data. We were hired by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources to look at deep-seated landslides and which areas were more active, and therefore where, when they were planning forestry activities, they needed to pay more care and attention. And a lot of this work was driven by the Oso landslide in 2014, which you see down below, which is part of our study area. So my colleague Corey Froese and I designed a project that utilized over 20 years of repeat LiDAR and INSAR, superimposed upon a very extensively mapped landslide data set by the Washington Geological Survey. And we've just a couple months ago embarked on for 6,000 landslides in those red areas that I showed you on the previous slide, using predominantly a Sentinel ascending and descending data set and a 2014 to present ALOS-2 ScanSAR, so coarse INSAR, and that's what you see on the right. It is an amazing data set. NASA and the Japanese Space Agency have collaborated, and there's a standard coverage over all the Western U.S., and we're able to actually generate one pretty amazing time series for most of these big deep-seated landslides in the region. So that's one of the areas that we're starting to scrape historical data here. Well, there's no point source data here, so we have to use remote sense data. We also have, again, multiple epochs of airborne LiDAR. The map below shows the number of vintages. In some cases, we have up to 5 vintages covering an area. Even though we're not able to get time series, we are able to understand which landslides have been active in a region, which helps us with our understanding of which geological units and topographic domains are more active. So we're using the data together to really start to piece together the story for these really complex landslides, because these technologies are quite complementary. The INSAR, the L band, will characterize between 12 centimeters per scene, whereas if you get something that moves quite rapidly, you won't see that trend, but you will likely, if it's moving too rapidly for the L band, you will see something in the LiDAR differencing. So two really nice data sets to help us confirm our stories. And we really started looking at who else internationally has been starting to look at regional activity characterization. There was a paper that came out of the Italian Research Council, Daniele Giordano's group by Cignetti in 2023, where they've really started building a systematic flow for assessing INSAR data and assigning activity levels. We've modified this with integrating LiDAR change detection, but this is exactly what we're doing. In Washington State, we're essentially doing what Cignetti has done in their paper for the Valle d'Aosta region in Italy, where we're classifying landslides as either predominantly active or predominantly inactive, and then where we have really good displacement data from INSAR, looking at homogeneity or heterogeneity of movements, and then where we have heterogeneity of movements, starting to look at drivers. So that's going very well. So the last piece here, and this is one of the major developments for us and the major innovation for us in deep-seated landslides. So we're looking at water balance. You need water to infiltrate and be resident in the system, in the kind of rupture zone to trigger accelerations. And it is an equation of water in versus water out. And how do you represent that at a site, but how do you represent that regionally? This is where we've really started using these global hydroclimatic models, as others are doing as well. We really, for our study, really started heavily utilizing the ERA 5 data, which is, you're just seeing the animation on the right, where between 1950 and present, there's modeled reanalysis data representing things like precipitation, snow melt, soil moisture at multiple depths. And we've been starting to use the deeper level 4 soil moisture product to look at how moisture trends have been changing both spatially and temporally, and how that correlates to landslide activity. We first started looking at this data in 2021, and on the left, this is a site on the Athabasca River where there's been slope inclinometers installed since the early 90s. I've been involved since probably the late 90s on this site. In 1997, 98, we sheared off a lot of slope inclinometers and had significant movements. 2012, 2013, 2016, and then in 2020, everything fell apart. So we really understand how this slope moves. This was the first slope where we said, well, let's start looking at some of the hydroclimatic data. The purple spikes moving down are snowmelt. The blue and gray spikes going up are different accumulations of precipitation. And the green is the modeled volumetric soil content. So if you look at the green line, one of the big things you want to see is that even if you start looking at snowmelt and precip, there's no smoking gun. But if you start looking at the relative combination of snowmelt, precip, things like evapotranspiration, and getting these model trends, we've had 3 significant decadal soil moisture highs: 1997, 98, 2012, and 2020. And those correspond beautifully with some of our really big landslide years. So that was quite interesting. We then started looking at other slides historically that we really didn't have instrumentation data, and started to see if we had any clues. We're working on a hydroelectric project on the Peace River in northeastern British Columbia, northwestern Alberta. And we had seen some recent slides in 2018 and 2020 that when you started plotting the hydroclimatic data, yes, we were in an elevated state. But we also had a large, well-documented slide in 1973 that there was no prior knowledge of what was happening prior to collapse. And it was just a snowmelt prior to collapse that triggered the actual timing. But when you look at the hydroclimatic data, 13 years prior to the collapse, we were wet the mean. So this data is really providing, we see at the course scale, it's providing pretty significant insights. So the challenge is, how do we utilize that in the shorter term to understand what's happening? These are tools that we're starting to integrate into more daily or yearly updates with clients. This is a snapshot for April 2024 of a normalized soil moisture, looking at percentile exceedance of soil moisture based on the record from 1950s for 74 years. Essentially, the dark brown this is the driest we've ever seen in 75 years, and dark blue would be the wettest we've ever seen. So, in areas like, we talked about the site we looked at, the Athabasca River around Fort McMurray. Yes, if you look at the map spatially, it's dark brown. And if you look at the time series on the right, third from the top, you see in 2020, when I showed you everything was falling apart, it was, pretty much at the 100th percentile for that they'd seen in 75 years. We're now in 2024, we were essentially the driest we have been in the 75-year record. And why that's important, and when I talked about that timing in one of the first slides on operators, if you're an operator that has, or a transit authority or a transportation authority that has assets across this entire area, and you know that an area like Fort St. John or Fort McMurray is in a historically dry trend, and likely you're not, there always are local exceptions, but likely in general, your slopes are going to be relatively, happy and slow, versus maybe an area like Edmonton where I am, you're relatively wet. You'll make different decisions as to where you invest your money this year, but also if you see you're still on a drying trend, or you're starting to, curve up and move back into a wetting trend. These are just things visually that operators are saying, this is another piece of data that I will use to support my planning. Of course, we're trying to take this into an automated, look at the data and generate alerts. With this data, don't have time to show you all the work from our data science team, but we did take a set of parameters from the ERA 5 data set, based the antecedent moisture, conditioning moisture, and then the seasonal inputs, and said, are there specific inputs that we understand that are better predictors? And we saw clearly that the soil moisture leading into the landslide season, before everything starts to melt, where we're already at a 50th or 70th or an 80th percentile, or where we dry, that matters. How that wetting trend was prior to freshet, were we already on a wetting trend, or were we on a drying trend? That matters. And not just this, it's not the snowmelt or the precipitation. The two of them need to be combined. If you have a lot of snowmelt and then no spring rains for a few weeks and things dry out, you don't get the same impact if you get snowmelt followed by rain. So starting to track rolling accumulation windows. And what we've seen so far are the preceding wetting trend. It's really the year or two that matters. And from what we've seen looking at rolling water accumulations, the 60 day appears to be the sweet spot right now. But again, we're looking across hundreds of landslides, so it's never going to be correct, but it's an indicator that seems to make sense. So what are we doing with all this? So we're at the stage where, we've done as much as we can with the data. I'm sure, we talked to many researchers at EGU that would love to take our data further, which we're happy to work with them. But our clients want to start taking these insights and starting us to tell them, what we think is happening. We are automating and pulling from the Copernicus data, the ERA 5, and we are actually starting to have tools available for our clients that they can actually look at soil moisture, current state and trends over space and time in relation to their sites. And our data science team is looking at taking the normalized soil moisture, the normalized data, those key parameters that I talked about, and coming up with what we think some thresholds look like. And again, I've just stolen from some of Ben's presentation graphics here below to look at, where we see populations, like, potential accelerations of populations of landslides in regions. And then we have a data set of over 60 continuously monitored slopes from shape pixel arrays over the last decade that we're going to start to test and work with clients to say, at what level would you have want to know? So we're not using a certain numerical value right now. It's we'll come up with values, test them, and say, when would we really want to start sounding the alarm, and calibrate that with known sites and with what clients would want to know. So last slide here. Again, we've learned a lot over the last 5 years about working with slowly moving landslides, and we hope some of you can benefit from this. You need to really understand your controls and landslide types and kinematics, and you need to have a kinematic model and hypotheses in your head for how these landslides are going to move. You're going to need to try to grab landslide activity from data from anywhere you can get it. Historical reports, instrumentation data, remote sense data, wherever you can get it. Data is valuable. It might not be as good as other data, but every piece of data tells part of the story. And you also need to understand what type of data you have and how that can characterize the displacements that you're trying to characterize. If you're trying to characterize something that's moving too slowly, something like LiDAR differencing won't work. Something that's moving too quickly, things like INSAR might not work. Vegetated terrain. You really need to understand, again, how things move and which technology is going to give you that picture. And then again, we've really seen that these global hydroclimatic models are becoming quite valuable to support. And at EGU a few weeks ago, we learned about other models people are using, but ultimately a lot of groups are starting to use these different models to look back and project forward. And where we hope this work goes, if we really start to understand what are those specific drivers, again, what drives soil moisture change, and how those drivers of soil moisture change are changing over time, and specifically future climate scenarios, that's where eventually as well where we'd like to take this type of work. So I work with a great team. You see my name here. Some of those names you'll recognize, but yeah, data scientists, geoengineers, earth observation specialists. A lot of amazing expertise, and with this work, you need all those types. So really happy to take any questions, and thanks for your time.